Yes, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Go and have a look at the seats. Wait, Silvilio, just take him us. He's doing a video. These are some friends of mine.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce Robin Sharwood, who is a committee member of the Friends of the Art Museum, and this is hosted by the Friends of the Art Museum. Robin Sharwood, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Welcome, everybody. It's great that there's such a big crowd, and well done to Cecil Kerbel and to Jean Wright for this evening. Congratulations to them. Before I hand over to Cecil, I'd just like to give the Friends of the Art Museum a quick punt. This evening is facilitated by the Friends of the Art Museum, and we're a public benefit organisation, and our role is to support the Art Museum in any way that we can. We sometimes help with the purchase of artworks. We purchase the wine for this evening and just try to help and make sure that things can happen. Please become a friend. There are membership forms at the reception desk, and please become a friend. We'd like to have your patronship, please. Cecil? I always think that it's a wonderful thing to have a dream and then to make it happen. And I think Cecil made his dream happen, and congratulations, Cecil.
Thank you. I just have a request to you all. Please don't wake me up from this 25-year-old dream. I want to thank a certain number of people, and in case I miss out on somebody, please forgive me. But there are certain people here who a thank you is just not good enough. And top of the list, and I really mean top of the list, and the others will forgive me because they'll agree with me. Top of the list is that fabulous lady called Jean Wright. Without Jean, this would not have happened today, because although I'd worked on this for, I suppose, at least 20 years, I got to a stage where I just couldn't go any further. I didn't have the knowledge that is required to look at Fred Page's work, to analyze it, and to give a view. And that's Jean Wright, because most of the copy script is Jean. She did enormous research, and I think she's done an absolutely brilliant job. Thank you very much, Jean. There's another guy here called Stephen Walker. He's the digital guy. If you look at the pictures and compare them to the paintings on the walls, you'll see that a brilliant job has been done, because it's not easy to photograph Fred Page and to reproduce them decently in the book. Stephen has done a brilliant job. Thanks, Stephen. By no means lost in this particular group is Kadar Printers, who are responsible for printing the book. And I think that after you've all seen the book, you will agree with me that it is an absolutely outstanding production. So thanks to Tim Douglas-Jones and Nigel Dean and his staff for the excellent work that they've done in printing this book. I want to thank Greater Than, the public relations company in Cape Town, the owner and of whom just by chance happens to be my daughter Galia, who is with us tonight. They've also done an excellent job, because we've received coverage on all the radio stations and all the newspapers throughout the country. So they've also done an excellent job. Robin Sharwood and Anthony Harris from the Friends have actually organized the exhibition. And I think you'll agree with me, it's an excellent exhibition, so thanks to them. Last in this group, my wife Miriam, who did a lot of work and a lot of support behind the scenes. Thanks, mate. This production could never have come about if it was not for the sponsors who arranged the finance for this production. It's not easy to finance an art book. I'm sure you'll all agree. Now, some of the sponsors are here this evening and who have come from out of town, and I would like to personally mention and thank them. There's Eli Goschalk, who I see has just arrived. Where are you, Eli? There we are. Eli only owns 21 Fred Page paintings. Then there's David Liknitsky. People don't see the wave. David was one of the few in the early 60s and 70s who bought Fred Page paintings. He owns only 20 Fred Page paintings. Fred Scott. Where are you, Fred? Right. Thank you, Fred. Fred also represents the auction company, Stefan Welz & Company. Patrick Scott, some of his beautiful paintings are hanging here. Thanks, Patrick. Hendrik van der Linde. Thank you, Hendrik. Stefan Welz, who represents Strauss & Company, also one of the sponsors, and the other sponsors are in the book. So enjoy yourselves, and it's my privilege, and I say that with a capital P, to introduce you to Stefan Welz. I don't need to say any more because you all know who he is, South Africa's authority on art and well-known auctioneer, Stefan Welz.
Thank you, Cecil. It doesn't make me any less nervous, let me assure you. I was noting to my colleague Vanessa Phillips, there's nothing more frightening than addressing a crowd that you don't know everybody. It does make a difference. In a certain sense, I feel I'm part of a Fred Page painting tonight. It's a dream. I was trying to work out when this book was first raised. It was an occasion that we were together at Joe Walpe's gallery, and when Cecil now said 25 years ago, I believe it was 25 years ago. Certainly going through my diaries, 18 years ago, he was already asking me for photographs, which I don't see evidence of having been used, so somewhere in the 18 years they disappeared. But it certainly remarkable, and it is Cecil's absolute dedication, passion, whatever one wants to describe it, that has made this book possible. It really is a remarkable achievement. And I'd like to believe, nobody can tell me with absolute certainty, but I believe it is the first art book which is solely produced in Port Elizabeth, in every sense of the word. And I think that's an amazing achievement, particularly given the times, circumstances. For those of you who've got the book, you've paged through it, I'm sure you're dying to get home and really get into it. It's great fun getting into it. It makes for lovely reading, I can assure you. And the pictures are, I cannot think of ever having the opportunity of having such an overview of Fred Page's work. There are over 300 illustrations in the book, and every one of them a gem in many respects, every one of them extremely interesting. And what really makes it a pleasure is that Jean has really sorted them in terms of period, in terms of subject matter and whatever. It follows beautifully. You see the progress throughout, and the commentary runs superbly with it. She draws your attention to the highlights and also his influences from art school days, books that he was influenced by, illustrations from books that he was influenced by, and everyday things that were going on around him. The buildings of Port Elizabeth, District 6, and then the forced removal of people, which distressed him very much. In fact, it's influenced him in many of his works. And his use of empty buildings, which makes for dead buildings, and a marvelous background backdrop to many of his paintings. Also events that prompted him in many of his subjects. It's a wonderful little mystery. You always try and think, well, what prompted the man to paint this? And there's one where he had an incident where he actually sat on his salami sausage and he wasn't able to eat it. And yet you look at the work and you don't quite relate. He's obviously soiled trousers at the back with the salami sausage in his back pocket with the painting. But it makes for an interesting situation. Then we have, of course, the famous one of the laying of the reef, the cenotaph in the front, and the opening of the Battis exhibition, which is also, I think, very interesting. From another source, Alexander Podleshuk, Pod, many of you know him or knew him, relates a humorous story of going to visit Page together with William Humphreys, who put the Kimberley Art Gallery together. And he wasn't quite sure where his house was, and he inquired and he was referred to a house, and he was, from knocking on the door, he was confronted by certainly not Fred Page, and it turned to be an old big game hunter who dragged them in and entertained them with all the mounted trophies on the wall and the thousands of photographs. And they duly excused themselves and went to the Wright House, which is across the road. But Alexander points out he's sure the two Pages got together, and Fred certainly drew from this collection of, shall we say, stuffed animal heads and what have you on the wall. I think also very important is that Jean gives us an overview of his life. Now, there are amazing gaps, and that, of course, arises because of Page's own reticence of discussing his past. Essentially, he was born in 1908 in northern Natal, and I think, reading through it, he could best be described as growing up in a poor white situation. In fact, very much so. He lost his mother at an early age, and his father didn't have fixed employment, to the extent that he was shuffled between various members of his family and spent some time in the Dutch Reformed Church orphanage, which certainly doesn't make for a happy life. I'm sure we'd all agree on that one. He went to trade school, at the age of 16 left, and had visions of becoming a poultry farmer. Well, I think we're all very grateful he didn't become a poultry farmer. It wasn't a success. He fell around. He then joined the South African Defence Force purely as a source of income, a bed, food, a roof over his head, which was also not the greatest. And then for some reason he finds himself coming to Port Elizabeth, where he works at one of the tyre factories, a soul-destroying job, which he himself describes as really just untenable. And with the outbreak of war, he signs up and actually does the full period of the war in the army. And coming out of the army, when he was demobbed, back to Port Elizabeth, and he discovers he qualifies for a bursary to study, to further his studies. And fortunately, he registers at the Port Elizabeth School of Arts and Crafts, then under Jack Heath. And it's a little uncertain whether he did a year or 18 months or 2 years, but he certainly had a very important year there. And Heath and his fellow educators, teachers, certainly did a sterling job in that year. He claims to have done a correspondence course in art before then. I personally have some doubt about that, but I would also have doubts about the merits of a correspondence course in art with no practical tuition. I think it must be a very limiting course, but so be it. It is, though, Page, despite coming out of art school, despite qualifying, despite starting as an artist, he gets no further than doing menial jobs. He, in fact, was doorman to this institution at some time. He wrote price tickets and sign writing for 2 department stores in between. All this time, he had the support of people like Dorothy Kay and many others, which I think he distanced himself from. And it's though he could never lift himself out of the poverty trap he was born into, despite the help and the encouragement he got from others. And I think throughout later life, that was also true of many of his problems. And I think that this insecurity throughout his life, and I believe he purposely, this veil, kept this veil of mystery over his life to hide his social inadequacies, because no doubt he had social inadequacies. He was briefly married for a very short period, obviously not successfully, divorced within a year or 2, and nobody knows of any further relationships of any nature in that regard. Perhaps it's interesting to look at his work and some indication of styles and so forth. And I do have a bit of a problem in that art historians, journalists, dealers, always want to pigeonhole an artist. It's where all these isms comes from, impressionism, whatever, cubism. They want to put an artist, slot him into a position. And not all artists can be slotted into a position. They also want to define periods in an artist's work, like Picasso's pink period or blue period or whatever the case might be. And this often leads to difficulties, actually. And I must admit that on reading the blurb on the inside front cover of this book, which is one of the first things I did, I was rather surprised to find that Page was described as South Africa's foremost surrealist painter. In fact, I didn't know we had any surrealist painter in South Africa, what's still to be the foremost. But then I must admit I was taken aback. But then as I read on, because I was sure there was going to be a barrage of criticism, Jean did very soon get into the text. She says, although Page's work bears some resemblance to that of European surrealists, his homegrown and idiosyncratic version, produced in the relative isolation of the city of Port Elizabeth on the seaboard of the Eastern Cape of South Africa, needs to be reassessed. She goes on to say, serious academic or art philosophical analysis is not within the scope of this book. I'm pleased she leaves it to somebody else to put their foot into that one. Wright, like many others, appreciates that Page cannot be pigeonholed as a surrealist. And it's actually interesting to go on with this. So by definition, Page is certainly not a surrealist. Just how difficult it is to categorize his work is reflected in the different opinions offered. Esmé Berman describes his work as being distantly related to the surrealist fantasies of the Belgian artist Paul Delvaux, as well as the ascetic pictorial enigmas of de Chirico. Dr. Melanie Hildebrand, who excuse me, quoting her, regards it unfortunate that Page has been described by some as belonging to a South African surrealism approximating that of Europe. She goes on to say the social and political circumstances of European surrealism are very remote from the private world of this very individual artist. And Alexander Podleshuk, in his introduction to the UNISA retrospective exhibition catalogue, discusses this issue at great length and ends by stating, his work is best classified as fantastic rather than illusionistic or surrealistic, but of one fact we may be certain. Page's compositions represent a cathartic experience, and the images are arrived at through a painful process of reference, extrapolation, and rearrangement. All movements are born during a certain historic period, and a series of differences and the feelings of like-minded groups of people either supportive of or violently against what they see happening. Impressionism cannot be replicated 100 years after the fact. Artists such as Adrian Boshoff, described as impressionist, is a joke. I would rather prefer the trade expression used, a Boer impressionist, and I think that places him in a better position than impressionist. And perhaps more correctly, as a copyist. Page's first encounter with art in the late 40s came after the heyday of the surrealist movement, and when he was fully fledged in his fantasies, he himself denied being a surrealist. I'm reminded there was a wonderful interview with MP van Wyk Louw, the famous Afrikaans poet, writer, who said he had got a letter from a schoolgirl saying that she and her boyfriend believed one of his poems was a love poem, and they enjoyed the poem together. But she's now gone to first-year university and one of the things in her syllabus is this poem, and the lecturer has come with totally different analysis of what the poem's all about. At which he replied back, "You and I know it's a love poem. Just do what the lecturer says to pass the exam." And I think there's a certain measure of truth in that. The Page as a person or a personality also comes across very varied in the various sources one pursues, and Jean brings us across very well in the book. And she quotes, amongst others, dissertation by Joan Fourie, essay by Nicholas Slubbert, which was published in Standpunten, Podleshuk's essay, previously spoke to you about, and Dr. Melanie Hildebrand's articles, more specifically that in the volume 4 of the series on South African artists. Wright notes that all four knew Page personally, yet their observations of him as a human being and an artist are at variance and reflect different aspects of the complex and intriguingly opaque creative personality of Fred Page. Now, they differ vastly, and it's interesting, you're going to read it in the book. And just as a matter of course, I had a look at outside people not quoted in the book. And possibly the most interesting is Dorothy Kay, who records him as suffering depression. And nowhere else does one read this. And looking at him, you look at the photographs of him, I sincerely believe he did suffer severe depression and was possibly very much part of his problem. But rather amusingly, Dorothy Kay says that in this period of depression, he was able to produce works at great speed. And in fact, they met each other at the Framer, and he had 5 or 6 works to frame, she had 1. And she says, I don't know how he gets so many painted. She notes he stated he had only completed 5 in the last month, to which she retorts, it takes her 5 years to do that. So, interestingly, she refers to his highly personal vision. And then, of course, she very much helped him in selling his work. She was a great patron, in fact, to him. Joe Walpy is a devoted dealer who was hoping to be with us tonight, but at 89 felt he'd like to sleep in his own bed. But he's very much with us in spirit. Notes his great integrity. It was an absolute one of the things. His great integrity. His very dry sense of humour, and his love for reading and classical music. In fact, they travelled between Cape Town and Port Elizabeth on numerous occasions. The one painting on the far corner there is, in fact, Joe Walpy, my friend behind me, sharing a room in a hotel in Mossel Bay. They didn't have the strength to last length, with Joe's then assistant Miriam also in the painting. And Joe remarks that on the one trip he was reading Waiting for Godot right through. He didn't lift his eyes virtually. He was so intense on reading this. Not something we all read very easily, certainly not while travelling, but anyway. That was Joe's observation. Yet with all this, one still comes away with a strong sympathy for the man, yet not a satisfied understanding of him or the force behind his work. Perhaps he was, and the very reticence that he had was purposeful. He wished us to see him as a mystery. He didn't want us to see him as and there's something of a conjective unexplained, which is the very thing that draws us to him. And his work. His work is not only a visual experience, can also be an intellectual experience, and in fact, very much can be both. Then there's the final chapter in the book, which is a very interesting look at the architecture which plays in Page's work. It's by Professor Robert Brooks, who sees architecture as an objective correlative. And it's extremely interesting. One knows most of the buildings, one recognizes the buildings, but the use of the buildings in the paintings and how he uses them makes extremely interesting reading in that theme. I'd like to make an observation here also. I'm nearly finished. The 3 Port Elizabeth artists who I think one can claim are really well known throughout South Africa, although I must admit I was amazed at how few people knew who Fred Page was when I said I was coming down to this occasion, are Dorothy Kay, Fred Page, and George Pember. I'm sorry, with all due respect to Joan Wright and many others, but those are the 3 that I think one can assume. And it's interesting that none of them painted still life. All of them painted people, and all of them painted architecture or people within an architectural situation. And I would have thought with the bum weather in Port Elizabeth, you'd all be inside painting still lifes rather than out there fending off the people. But it's an interesting observation. And then you go just 100 kilometres to Grahamstown, and you've got a totally different animal, completely. I'm not here to discuss Grahamstown this evening. It's also a remarkable group. But it's interesting the differences and how this group pursues this specific situation. Perhaps something which I'm best qualified to speak about is the market for the work of FredPage. Now, I think all of you will agree with me that in general terms, possibly best described in Afrikaans, his work is volksvreemd. It's not what Mrs. van der Merwe and Mrs. Smith visualize above their mantelpiece. It requires a certain frame of mind, a certain broadness of life, and various other aspects. So it's not surprising to find that there are not a great number of people who own FredPages, but those that do, by God, do they own FredPages. It's just phenomenal. And one of the lasting memories I have in my career was probably one of the finest and nicest FredPage collectors was Julius Marshall. I'm sure Cecil would agree with me, Julius Marshall. Julius and his wife Sheila. Julius had suffered a stroke, so his face was partially paralyzed, which he was very conscious of. He had difficulty with his speech. But they had put together an amazing collection of FredPage's work through Joe Walpy. And when they emigrated, they decided it was not fitting to take them away. They felt this was a South African treasure and belonged in South Africa. They had no ulterior motive. He just felt it belonged here, which I think is a beautiful thing to start with. The tears rolled down his face when we took them out of his house, and I mean it. It was, you could have taken a child out of the house. It was just so moving. As I said, it stayed with me all my life. The only nice thing about it was virtually every one of them made a cracking record price on that auction and put FredPage well on the map. And it's perhaps interesting to just compare Page in certain respects in the marketplace. In 1997, the top price for a FredPage was 15,000 Rand. 10 years later, it jumps to 160,000 Rand. Tenfold in 10 years. Much as Cecil's pushing down here in the south, I'd like to believe, and Joe Walpy's encouragement and many other people's encouragement. But that's certainly, I think, no mean achievement to see that sort of escalation in demand. But not only is the subject matter difficult for many, South Africans are less inclined to buy works on paper and even less works behind glass. They want an oil on canvas, the ultimate. It's just part of the market, sadly. Also, FredPage is too rare. He does not appear in the marketplace often enough. The market wants to see action in an artist's work. They want to gauge price. They want to measure things. And there's nothing like money to measure things. You can tell somebody that's the most beautiful painting ever painted in South Africa, and they might give it 2 minutes. Tell them it's worth 20 million, they'll stop for half an hour and find out why the hell's it, where's the 20 million come into it. So money is a factor in that sense. But if one, just as a matter of interest, in the last 15 years, only 127 works by FredPage have come onto the market. That's less than 10 a year. In contrast, we have PNF with over 800, Irma Stern with nearly 400, Gregoire Bunzai with over 1,000, and Claret with over 800. So you realize that FredPage is really a very small part of the auction market. Fred's top price is still 160,000, PNF 9.5 million, Irma Stern 30 million, Gregoire Bunzai, who I don't believe should be above Fred in price, 1.2 million, and, well, Claret, much to my staggering surprise, still 260,000, and then worst of all, Adrian Boshoff, 1 million. So there's something wrong with the art market if it comes to quality and seriousness and integrity in work. Cecil, Jean, thank you very much for presenting us with a marvellous work. It's put Fred Page, elevated him to where he should be. It's opened the door, I'm sure, for many people who've never heard of him before in their lives, bring awareness. And I trust it's going to encourage many students to do a thesis on aspects of his work. And it's all thanks to you. And may the book bring you great happiness and success, which I have no doubt. And I think all of us share our gratitude and admiration for what you've done. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to tidy up. So you'll have to bear with me for another 2 minutes. I'm not going to be very long. First of all, I'd like to thank Stefan for a very interesting address and the facts and figures which fleshed out the rest of both the book and the exhibition. It really is a completely rounded profile now. Thank you. And thank you for schlepping all the way down to the Eastern Cape. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Hillebrand and her staff, who really went the extra mile for this exhibition. Emma Taggart, who hung the exhibition, and Anthony, for the work that you put into it. Thank you very much. And Werner, where are you? Who dug up mountains of information out of archival boxes in the museum. Thank you very much. Cecil, who dragged me into this project. I salute the passion with which you pursued this dream. I really do. You were tenacious and you hung on to it with the tenacity of a bulldog. You bullied me and I learned how to bully you back. But we never fought. We actually just horse traded most of the time.
What was the colour of your hair before you started?
Nobody warned me. To Miriam, who watched the creation, incubation, and birth of this book, you were a midwife with tea and sympathy. Thank you very much. The other subversive man that I want to mention is my friend Stephen Walker, who was a real find. He, with endless patience and the minimum amount of fuss, turned pages which are very difficult to get the detail right. He put them on a big Apple Mac and he'd say to me, "Come and look at this." He said, "Have you seen that?" Because I got small digital stuff, and on my computer, yes, it was all right. But on Stephen's Apple Mac, we found all sorts of secrets. Thank you, Stephen. And the last thing I want to say, which I'm very proud of, is the fact that this is a Port Elizabeth book. We were going to get bits of it done in Cape Town, and we did it hands-on here. So in Obama's words, which I think it's right, yes, we can. Thank you.
Miriam, do you want to? Miriam would just like to read a few words from your daughter.
No. You'll have to all excuse the tears. Hello, everybody. Dearest Cecil, come, both of you. Come, please. You can also come. Well, what to say on such an auspicious day? From our first visit to PE, almost 12 years ago, you've been talking about this book, Cecil. And who knows how long before that. Some people just put something like this on their to-do list. But you made it happen. And Jean, we have you to thank for that. Without your expertise, your knowledge and insight, but mostly your sharing in Cecil's passion, I don't think the family would ever have heard the end of it. The one day I'm going to write the book about him. Well done to both of you for making it happen.
Thank you.
Gideon and I never imagined in our wildest dreams and expectations it to be as an impressive piece of literature, as it is, and so richly graphic, so beautifully collated and presented. We can't wait to receive our sponsor's edition. Cecil, I know I'm proud of you. I know your kids from a distance are longing to be there. Gali and Omri have the proud honor, there they are, of sharing in your special day. Mer, your mate, I'm certainly standing proudly next to you as always. You and Jean must be gleaming with pride. I'm nearly finished. But most of all must be FredPage, who must be smiling down in pride and awe that you, someone so close to him, could honor him, his remarkable talent, and his life as you have. We hope this day will be and was all you dreamed it to be. We look forward to hearing all about it. With love and pride from Jody, Gideon, your granddaughters Hayel and Gila. P.S. Now we can have the spectacle of sleep.
That's my son who's booked it for 25 years' time. But all I want to say is now you know why I'm married to her. Who? I told you that's why you know why I'm married to her. Enjoy yourself.